esteemed colleagues, I wanted to point out something to start. This is about women leading in diplomacy and defense. And you see this here. There is not women, nor even a woman. The AI platform that I use to help me format slides takes the PDF and keywords, and it will structure based on what I instruct it to do. So when it says diplomacy, this is the auto-generated image for a diplomat, which informs the conversation we're going to have today about this talk, because the point is to center women in the conversation for defense and diplomacy rather than put them in a separate track. So this would be the real cover with an actual woman. Okay, these are the things that we're going to cover today. From gentleman's war to strategic parity, women leading in diplomacy and defense. We'll talk about parity through modern leadership, the idea of gentleman's war, blurring the lines in diplomacy, la manoeuvre as feminine strategy, underappreciated female contributions, digital diplomacy and transparency, leadership in modern warfare, and strategic power dynamics in 15 minutes. So it's a privilege to speak to you. I'm a doctor of leadership, which allows me to toggle between business and international relations, specifically speaking on leadership and diplomacy issues. And my core area has been the Russian war in Ukraine. At the heart of my research lies an intricate leadership ecosystem shaped by integration of diplomacy, discourse analysis, and psychobiography. What I'd like to present to you is the idea that la manoeuvre in diplomacy and defense is a concept that challenges traditional strategic thinking by introducing a female-centered lens that not only redefines battlefield tactics, but also highlights adaptive and flexible approaches that women in leadership bring to diplomacy and conflict. These approaches are informing global defense strategies and offering new insights into how modern warfare and diplomacy are conducted. Last year, I had the opportunity to speak about Clausewitz and cognitive warfare. So as I referred to him then, our friend Carl, I'm certain he didn't conceive that he would be in a gender-related conversation topic. So like some drinking game, I've now done that. We're going to have a gender-related conversation, which is really about diplomacy. But I'll mention that Clausewitz emphasized in his theory of war that it involves the strategic application of all available means. And this includes, broadly, leadership, troop deployment, and the preparation of nations for conflict. This is the framework that I approached looking at women in diplomacy and defense and how adjacent it is to leading, directing in crisis, conflict, and war. So today we're witnessing a more nuanced application of this conduct with female leaders applying la manoeuvre, a multidimensional approach which blends strategy, ethical decision-making. Despite the increasing influence of women in critical defense and policy roles, their contributions are often examined through separate, narrowly defined frameworks. Too often, female-led governments are categorized solely within gender or feminist perspectives, leading to a fragmented or siloed understanding of broader strategic and operational impacts. This separate treatment risks creating gaps in how we analyze diplomacy and defense as an integrated discipline, overlooking the complex and sophisticated leadership approaches that women bring to the forefront of times in conflict and peace. Prior to 1960, there was no democratically elected female leader. If you're going to look historically at paradigms of women directing diplomacy or defense, you would be looking at Cleopatra or Queen Elizabeth I prior to 1960, a monarch. And research about monarchs and how they conduct war is very different than what it is suggesting women in democratically elected governments do. So by embracing la manoeuvre, female leaders are not only altering defense strategies, but redefining diplomacy itself, showing that diplomacy and defense can be understood as a single, cohesive discipline reflecting a full range of humanity. So with humility, I invite you to explore this with me. how quietly yet powerfully the influence of female leaders are in diplomacy and security studies. So the concept I started with, la manoeuvre. As you see, a female-centered strategic approach to diplomacy and defense, focusing on adaptive, flexible decision-making, rooted in a metaphor of maneuver. It integrates sex-specific traits like collaboration, ethical leadership, multidimensional risk perception to redefine contemporary conflict and diplomacy strategies. La maneuver, or the word maneuver, is actually linguistically female. That's where this conceit came from. Linguistically, it's female. Additionally, these traits that I listed are borne out by research, and I'll get to those later. So the idea of a gentleman's war is a historical conception to what I'm calling ungentlemanly warfare, because there are no gentlemen examined here. Gentleman's war, historically aristocratic and chivalric approach to warfare, governed by honor, strict rules of engagement. This concept, now outdated, reflected a formal, restrained way of conducting war that has been eclipsed by modern hybrid warfare tactics. I would also suggest an unrestrained cruelty and complete disregard for international law on the Russian side. Ungentlemanly warfare. This is how I've defined it: a contemporary adaptive approach to warfare and diplomacy led by women, breaking away from traditional, rigid, and aristocratic rules of engagement, emphasizing flexibility, strategic compassion, and the integration of female leadership traits in military and diplomatic maneuvers. So this idea, diplomat or diplomatus, there's not a word in English that suggests a binary difference in the role of diplomat. It is specifically male, and yet increasingly women are represented in the highest levels of state governance, as well as foreign ministries and defense ministries. This is an overview of select female leaders from 2018 to 2024, covering some of the pre-war warm-up through present. Many of these female leaders are first of their kind in their state. Now, forever, we had Mutti Merkel, the only lady standing among men in what I discovered. She has 80 colors of the blazer style that she wears, 80 colors. So she was appropriately outfitted for her role. She dressed in a way that she said presented no surprises. And she had to take on this persona. She didn't want her outfit to be a distraction. And this is important when considering women, because they navigate what's called a double bind. They have to, in order to preserve sentiment and public morale in a democracy and secure public support, women navigate the double bind, as I mentioned, which is demonstrating both a competency and a femininity. Here are foreign ministers. Here's a list of defense ministers. This isn't exclusively about holding a title. If you think about the number of women that are heads of state and the possibility of Kamala Harris being elected in the United States, and asterisk, for a short time, it was considered possibly a female PM would take over in Japan. So that would be 1 billion people represented by a female voice for the first time. And that is what constitutes the cohort that I'm going to speak about. Okay, we're going to get to this in a minute. So the concept of gentlemanly warfare, as I mentioned, once rooted in chivalry, is now has been eclipsed. And these traditional doctrines have faded from our strategic discourse. So I mentioned Ukraine. Against this backdrop, I believe these women are altering the operational environment by introducing notably contemporary flexibility to military and diplomatic operations, and their contributions are critically underappreciated. I'll give one example. Women were leading Sweden and Finland at the time of their ascension to NATO, even though these are long discussions, and the approval process takes some time. Women were leading at the time, and both of those women came into office thinking that NATO was off the table or not in the immediate future. And after the invasion of Ukraine, well, we have 2 new NATO members as a result. So this is proof of policy. This isn't a qualitative study that I'm showing you. There are empirics about behavior and foreign policy changes that didn't exist prior to this. So I'll explain this cohort. As I mentioned, some of these females, heads of state, are the first of their kind. Meloni is the first female PM of Italy. So if you look at the number of heads of state in Europe, this is female, bound by a geography, a temporality, and a crisis. If you are conducting research and you're looking for your variables in order to create a cohort to examine, this cohort presented itself. Typically, with the discourse around the war, I've looked at Zelensky as the lead statesman on the matter. When I compared his discourse to female discourse, there's a binary difference. Using RStudio, female statements about the war in Ukraine differ dramatically from his, a binary choice. I compared Zelensky against a cohort, a psychological data set of other global leaders, and he is distinctly different from them. So when I ran the females against the 6 women in that existing data set, they are also distinctly different. So I believe I've substantiated that this is a cohort and they behave differently. So looking at the Euro-Atlantic security posture, prior to the war in Ukraine, there's a couple of key events that were decided by females that had a lasting impact. So that's what I'm asking you to consider today. When talking about diplomacy and defense, it's always been my conceit that there's an agent actor and they make a significant difference and can have an outcome. And it could be heroic or it can be villainous, or it could be somewhere vanilla in between. But individuals can make a difference with singular actions. And that's why it's important to understand how females lead, how they make decisions about money and allocating resources, and some of the flexibility, such as in Denmark, deciding that female conscription was now part of their national security plan, or the idea to send F-16s to Ukraine. This was led by female. Additionally, recently in the news, with Operation Grim Reaper against Hezbollah, a woman designed that protocol, start to finish. So again, thinking about individual decision-making and conceptual complexity, it is reducing all other variables to only considering sex-bound characteristics, there's a distinct difference. And so that's what needs to be understood. Again, the US election is highly contested, and there's a lot of predictions about who is going to be a better leader in terms of leading the US as a partner to NATO. So some of these psychobiographical traits should be considered if you're going on to Polymarket to lay your political bet. That's something I would consider. So one more time, I'd like to say that security strategists should consider that categorizing female-led government under a title and limiting it to a gender or feminist track heightens the risk of misinterpreting global security. So considering the French word maneuver, grammatically feminine, I'm using this as the metaphor to walk you through what I think are inherently feminine traits and psychobiographies in female decision-making. Meloni is a key example of somebody, again, first of her kind, and she has bilaterally made security arrangements with Ukraine and other nations. She is keen to associate with Modi of India. This hashtag Melodi, a combination of their names, went significantly viral. After that, Modi went to Ukraine for the first time, arranged for a bilateral security agreement. He has since met Zelensky in the United States. I would argue we could have a correlation, if not causation, that setting an example and creating associations across diplomatic channels can improve relationships globally. Again, correlation or causation, we can sort that out. But she is often featured with heads of state, and she enjoys a high level of approval in Italy. I'm going to asterisk my conversation here today to say domestic politics in each European state is not my area. So if she is your elected leader or any of these women and you aren't a fan, that is absolutely not considered as part of my study. I'm not here to weigh in on whether they're leading in a domestic sense appropriately, satisfactorily. Okay. Does anyone know what this is, one less plane? This was a hashtag. At one point, a defense minister in Germany was asked what would happen if Ukraine were to shoot down a Russian plane. She answers, there would be one less plane. Matter of fact and very blunt. In the meanwhile, I would offer that some of Ukraine's more traditional partners, the United States and Germany, have demonstrated a timidity or an incrementalism and restricted Ukraine from firing across their country boundary, whereas the female perspective, when using discourse analysis, is blunt with no room for ambiguity. It's very direct. So one less plane is how I would summarize that positionality. Okay. Here's what research shows. Key female traits in foreign policy and defense. There's a collaborative leadership diplomacy, strategic foreign policy, adaptive decision-making, value orientation, and a risk perception. I'm going to tell you more about that. Okay. So, collaborative leadership and diplomacy. It's different than a male perspective, and women have been shown in research to have more deeply collaborative relationships, especially in conflictual scenarios. So there is a prioritization of collaborative approaches and coalition building, as well as a balance of task-oriented activities with relational considerations, building and sustaining robust alliances, and this relational emphasis supports ability to foster strategic partnerships and enhance public diplomacy efforts, allowing them to navigate complexities. Again, when women are elected leaders or in a role, they're often placed on what is called the glass cliff. In my corporate work, it's been proven women are brought in when a company is in crisis. And if she fails, it's because she's a woman, not because the situation was untenable or the crisis was too severe or just irretrievably broken. The blame will fall, as borne out by research, on the fact that she is a woman. So the collaboration and far-reaching adaptation is more for the success. And again, research will show that women will invest more effort, time, money, blood and treasure, if you will, to have a successful outcome. In corporate sense, when women apply for a job, they often present a resume with no flaws because of risk-taking, whereas a male will be less risk-adverse. Women demonstrate a hesitancy, so a collaborative, interwebbed relationship helps cover more bases. I'll get more to risk perception next. Strategic foreign policy. I didn't realize how tall she is as compared to him. Okay, this reflects an ability to craft and implement broad, clever, multimodal strategies that integrate humanitarian considerations and long-term global stability into domestic and international agendas. This is an area where revised and aligned policies across various domains. I've already mentioned a couple that were significant in changing the complexion of European defense, such as 2 new member nations of NATO, sending F-16s to Ukraine, as well as many bilateral security agreements between states headed by women. They also tend to focus on policies that are ethically sound, but strategically practical, so as to cover 2 parts of humanitarian and security. adaptive decision making. There's a more flexible, I wanted to point that out, responsive in rapidly changing and ambiguous environments. Women will adapt and change their mind or direction in a polycrisis situation, making for a more informed decision-making in modern warfare and diplomacy. I would like to, one more time, asterisk this to say this isn't preferencing females over males. This is to say understanding, again, cognitive and psychobiographical traits is important to understanding. If you are here studying war and warfare, knowing your enemy or knowing your friend is really important, and looking at predictive capability, I think it's important to understand a diversity in cognitive and behavioral approaches. Value orientation. This often shows up with females in that this responsibility to protect is prioritized. There was a lot of discussion around the dam in Ukraine before it was blown. The idea to protect this, was there an international coalition, or could NATO or some other organization have safeguarded the dam before this ecocide and the destruction of property and life, and again, something irretrievably broken at this point, the damage. But the idea of a responsibility to protect, to be in front of a disaster, is stronger in a female-led framework. Risk perception. This is biological. It's borne out in all animal species and humans. Women have a more sophisticated multimodal risk perception. It's not a singular track. It's many ideas at once, understanding where risk is coming, and biologically speaking, females look further out for risk, anticipating it much further ahead. Consider the leaders of the Baltic states. Each of them were warning of Russian aggression, and many of their warnings were dismissed as being the Cassandras of the eastern flank. So from Greek mythology, when Cassandra warned of impending disaster and she was disregarded, the same thing has happened in what they call the Baltic Sisterhood. This is self-named. That would be Kaja Kallas, Estonia, Latvia, and Šimoneta in Lithuania. They consider themselves the Baltic Sisterhood. Now these two ladies, Salome Zhorab-Shalivi of the Republic of Georgia and Maya Sandu of Moldova, are both headed for re-election. They were first of their kind. They may be, in Salome's case, last of her kind. It is a very vulnerable election, and in Moldova as well, a highly contested issue. But they each spent a good amount of time making deeper, further, and stronger connections across the European community. And in terms of this risk perception and alliance making, Zhorab-Shalivi faced impeachment after she went on her EU tour. She was successful internationally, less successful domestically, and she is up against a very insidious enemy in terms of her re-election. Okay. So I've mentioned a couple of policy decisions. I'd like to tell you a few more, but understanding that this transformation in traditional diplomatic and defense roles reflects a broader societal pattern. And also this line between diplomat and diplomatus is blurring. I think that we're missing the vocabulary to fully capture what this is. So throughout war and security agreements, the bilateral nature of securitized arrangements has increased in Ukraine. Two women I haven't mentioned yet, Ursula von der Leyen and Roberta Metsola, are often considered queens of European diplomacy in that they faced a difficult re-election, Metsola less difficult than von der Leyen, but continue to cement their leadership across EU and EU Parliament and are very vocal about supporting Ukraine in terms of resources. Which brings me to the next part. There's, as I mentioned, very specific efforts to bring more money to the defense of Ukraine. At the same time, increasing a defense budget in a singular state increases their security, which then reflects better on the broader coalition of NATO, specifically Baltics and Nordics, in some of their security arrangements, bolstering the flanks of that organization while increasing their defense. In part of my research, looking at the overall total budget, many of these states have now exceeded the requisite percentage contribution to NATO up until almost 4%, which is 67% of their domestic budget. And I wanted to indicate one significant detail. Mette Frederiksen has been very active and very flexible and creative in some of her solutions. And it's interesting what she has chosen to do almost as a benefactor, because the GDP of Denmark has doubled in the past couple of years. And this is exclusively from one company in Denmark, Novo Nordisk, who produces Ozempic. Their national GDP doubled from one singular drug. So when the state coffers are full, you're more flexible to pursue humanitarian priorities. She also, as I said, sent F-16s to Ukraine. She's also willing to send most munitions to Ukraine because, again, she has a substantial budget to do so. So in conclusion, here's what I think we should consider going forward. That this is a more complete paradigm of diplomacy and defense, reshaping diplomacy and defense, challenging traditional frameworks. There's broader impacts on global security, limitations to overcoming this concept. I wanted to put in my point of view based on evidence about Kamala Harris to say she is highly popular across the European community as the next leader. I would look at her body of work as an example. She wants to own the decision of the US's mortifying withdrawal from Afghanistan. She believes she was the last person in the room when these decisions were made. She also recently has restricted further arms sales and delivery to Israel of the 2,000-pound bombs. She advocated strongly against Israel's actions in Rafah and against Hezbollah. She has a very particular conceit. So the idea that money or security or decision-making is predictable based on a feminine framework or an existing conception of U.S. foreign policy, I would suggest some caution before interpreting her operational code. I would also mention what I wrote in my paper, her thin record of achievement. Okay, just to get that on the record, thin record of achievement. So in closing, I believe there's an effect to show how we've shifted to an ungentlemanly warfare in that a sizable percentage of the population of the globe, as well as significant percentages of defense budgets, are now controlled in a way that is differed from the existing model to this point. Thank you.